Hi, good morning. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, I'm sorry, my computer at the last minute crashed, so I had to quickly switch to my phone. Yeah, I'm here.
Not a problem. Always happens.
Yeah.
Can't really depend on technology. But just wanted to understand, Anantha, what is it that you made of Powell's statements, and how soon can we actually, expect the Fed to begin tapering?
Well, I mean, he did hint that it could start sometime in the course of this year. We have only about 4 more months to go. But it was deliberately left vague. I kind of, for the time being, I agree with the market reaction, which is to largely ignore the implicit warning. Because I think many of us make the mistake sometimes that the announcements by officials are a prelude to action, but sometimes they could be merely substitutes for action. In other words, there may not be an intent to walk the talk, but to simply talk the talk because that is what the market wants to hear at this point in time, lest inflation expectations get too far out of control. So I see it more as some sort of a spin or a management to talk of tapering, just so that the orthodox voices don't get too worried and has a spill. So it's about managing the process of keeping the monetary policy accommodative for a long period. That is how I see it.
Right. Morning, Mr. Nageswaran. Nikunj Dalmi also joining in. So, for an outsider who has fundamentally bought and invested into equities or commodities with the principle that there is central bank liquidity and central
Mhm.
banks will do whatever it takes to fix the economy, has that approach changed, or that approach still remains the same?
Well, unfortunately, that approach still remains valid because even if there is an attempt to reduce the quantum of assets purchased by the Federal Reserve, the point is they will not be able to hold on to that approach for quite some time. They would rather be forced to come back to that policy because they have gone too far down that path. So, if at all there is an accident that is going to come for markets, which they will, because obviously bubbles never continue forever, and that is what history tells us. They may last longer than what some of the value based investors might like to believe, but they never continue forever. So, but the threat to the market coming from liquidity will be transient, and because central banks have gone too far down this path, they cannot roll it back. So at the first sign of market wobble or instability, they will be forced to revert back to their accommodative stance because they are trapped and they are locked into it. That is my view.
So, what is the out of jail card? Because ultimately, we have to come out of the jail. Now, this is not going to
Yeah,
last forever. This monetary printing or monetary
yeah,
policy has surprised all of
yeah.
us. We thought that it would end in 2012 or 13. It is
That's right.
2021. It is not ending. So,
Right.
life cannot be that simple that central bankers will print money and keep on buying stocks. It's sounding very simple, but that's how it is right now.
No, no, absolutely, you are right. I share your question. What is the way out of this? If that is what you meant by saying what is the get out of jail card, I don't think they have a get out of jail card. In other words, therefore, events will dictate how they get out of it. I think they have largely lost control of the process that they have initiated. If anything, at every opportunity, instead of rolling back and putting the economy through a short-term pain, which is inevitable when you want to withdraw the liquidity support. But instead, they have doubled down. Whether it is the pandemic, whether it is the eurozone crisis, or whatever it is, or 2018, the pivot from normalizing monetary policy towards accommodative stance in 2018, etc. At every single opportunity, when the first sign of instability arose, they have doubled down. So, in that sense, the get out of jail will happen when something else beyond their control forces them to abandon this policy, or in the worst case scenario, the reserve currency status of some of these major Western developed nations currencies is comes under threat, including that of the dollar. And that is the only way. And that is what happened in the late 70s. And that is what forced Paul Volcker to show that dollar remains supreme by raising interest rates to 16% and so on, engineering a double dip recession. And then he re-established monetary normalcy in that process. So you have to, therefore, be forced by circumstances to reverse course on their own. They are not going to do it, but circumstances will come. The difficulty that you and I have is to predict the timing of it.
Very interesting. Hi, Mr. Nageswaran. This is Mubina as well joining in. So essentially, you believe if the circumstances are set to come, which will put the Fed in a position that, look, we had no option, we had to do this. Does that mean you're also making a case of a stronger US dollar from here on?
No. On the contrary, their approach right now is to actually let the dollar depreciate and dollar remain weak. And in fact, what they want is unanticipated inflation to pick up. See, basically, if you go back and look at what happened in the 70s, both in the US and in the UK, the government debt to GDP ratio came down dramatically. In the US, from 55% of GDP to 35% by the end of the 70s, in 20 years. In the UK, it was far more dramatic. It came down from 100% of GDP in 1961 down to 40% of GDP by 1979. How did they achieve it? They achieved it through massive inflation and a boost to nominal GDP. This is what they want to do it, maybe not in the same scale, but that is what they are looking at. They can't say it openly. So this is all about stealth inflation. That is why the emphasis on transient, so that you don't incorporate the inflation expectations into contracts, such as interest rates and wage contracts, but inflation will continue to simmer under the surface. That's the whole strategy. So therefore, in this situation, a weak dollar is necessary, is inevitable, unavoidable. The problem will come only when this strategy goes out of control and there is a threat to the dollar. So therefore, I would think a strong dollar is not the outcome, but the default outcome is weak dollar. Only when it becomes too difficult to manage will they be forced to reverse course. When there is a threat to the dollar status in a very big way, that is when they'll be forced to reverse course. Until then, they would like to prolong this and try to substitute talking for acting. So all this talk about taper, all this talk about keeping inflation expectations under control and being willing to act when needed is all required to maintain the facade of some sort of prudence, and that is not being given the go by, because what they are pursuing is completely different. So do not be misled by the talk.
The fact that the US is one of the most indebted economies today in the world
right.
is not something that's perturbing the central bank at all as they look at as they look at depreciating the US dollar, because that's obviously something that will hurt their debt and their bills a lot.
No, it won't. They will be repaying you in a weak currency. They borrow in their own currency. And in fact, the fact that they are a highly indebted country is indeed perturbing them, to use your words. And that is the reason why they are pursuing stealth inflation. That's why I told you the way they reduced the debt ratio by 20 percentage points in the 60s and 70s was through inflation. And that is the name of the game now. So it is perturbing them. And that is why this policy approach. And a weak dollar, it is not my problem, it is your problem. That is what America tells the outside world, because they pay for it in their own currency. Whether it is debt, whether it is imports, they pay in their own currency. Until and unless this gets out of hand, which it will if pursued for a long period. And that's why I told you about what happened in the late 70s. And Paul Volcker had to eventually step in. So that is what we should expect, a replay of that. Obviously, history never repeats, but it will largely rhyme as we go into the later half of this decade.
Of course, a depreciation in the currency is only the problem of all the non-US dollar denominated countries, never of the US dollar. But this was such an interesting conversation. Thanks so much, Mr. Nageswaran, for joining us.